So I first met Igea in her role as editor-in-chief of Architecture and Cultural Journal, recently award-winning journal. I've lost my notes to introduce you, but I'll let you talk about yourself. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm from Oxford Brookes. So I guess the way that, thank you to Jonathan for inviting me. The connection is, I guess, I've been running a design research module at Brookes in the Masters called Research-Led Design since 2007. So I guess we're starting about the same time. And there were just discussions between people about the similar kinds of programs. Now, ironically, I'm not going to talk about any of my students' work. I guess I've been trying to sort of understand the landscape within education of what design research is. And for me, to be perfectly honest, it comes out of the fact that the way I was educated, I just sort of disagreed with. I think it was too restricted. Architecture can be very prescriptive. It can be debilitating. And I guess research-led design for me, and even the way I think practice should occur, should be a much wider and more open kind of practice. So, when Jonathan asked me for a title, I decided I was going to sit down and write this, which is about the design of what as a method of architectural research, from Henry van der Velde to Zaha, Hadid. Hopefully it will all become clear as we go along. So, design research emerged as a field of study in the 1960s as an inquiry into the process of design. It was developing from work in design methods, so it was particularly a questioning of the methodology used. John Christopher Jones's 1970s book, Design Methods, set out an argument for methods of design research beyond design by drawing. And I think this is a really important thing to think about, because in architecture, we design by drawing. That's the convention. We produce orthographic drawings. Now, what was put forward by Jones was many other different ways or methods that we might design. So some of them are as a process of devising not individual products but whole systems or environments, design as participation, design as creativity, seeing design thinking as an exceptional method of research, design as an educational discipline that unites arts and science and perhaps goes even further than either, design without a product as a process or way of living in itself. Now, while the concept retains a sense of generality aimed at understanding and improving design practices broadly, it has in recent years entered architectural scholarship as a discipline-specific practice. Architectural design research, I think, I've been trying to sort of sort this out in my mind, but I think it manifests in two ways. The first one is fully within the discipline of architecture. It involves the act of designing a building as part of the process of research, much as a composer would write a piece of music as part of their research praxis. Following G. James Dackent's book, Artist Scholar, this kind of research is aligned with research in the arts, understood mainly as practice-based research, that can take the form when creative works are considered both the research and the object of research itself. Now, if we look at the recent literature published in this field, so this book series, which has already been discussed, but also there are a ton of design research conferences that are hitting architecture. So I would say in the last 5 years, there have just been an enormous amount of discussions about what this field might be. But anyway, the scholarship is really most comfortable considering architecture as the design product, with the design research methods used by architect scholars being the set used by the architect designer. So here we're thinking of designing by drawing or design by model making or designing by prototyping. These are quite conventional methods. As I said, all of this happens inside the disciplinary boundaries of the profession. Okay, but while many critics argue that worthy contribution can only be made to a discipline by knowing and working within its boundaries, and here I'm thinking of Rosalind Krauss on the left, she writes that you can't actually contribute to a discipline unless you know it, you've read it, you understood it, and working outside of that means that you make less of a valid contribution. Other people like Julia Kristeva or Elizabeth Gross, and on the right, Mark Linder, they all contend that operating outside a discipline's range of acceptable design products might in fact open the discipline up to new design methods and forms of discourse. This second type of architectural design research is more radical. It's actually non-architecturally specialised because it manifests outside the discipline itself. This kind of research is either interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. The researcher again works creatively, but this time between and across one or more other disciplines alongside a key line of inquiry in architecture. As Linder explains in his essay, Transdisciplinarity, in this type of architectural design research, quote, architecture makes its appearance other than as architecture. Now, in the second group, other artefacts are produced beyond a building design. Okay, so things like performance, set design, a piece of jewellery, a film, a light fitting, cutlery, a costume design or an installation, as I've shown here. So this one's the outcome of the collaboration of two people, the American architect Jenny Sabin and the molecular biologist Peter Lloyd-Jones in the Practice Lab studio. We actually published a whole issue of Architecture Culture on Disciplinary Practices, and this was part of the issue, talking about when architects collaborate with other experts, what happens to change the object that's produced as design research. Now, since the advent of industrialisation, architecture's been dominated by the debate between Henry van der Velde and Adolf Loos, between the decorated urn and the chamber pot. Here, the deeply embedded preoccupation of architecture, the relation between form and function, raises its ugly head. Architecture remains obsessed with wrestling with form-making forever after, although nowadays it's extended to animated, digital, interactive form-making, etc. But architects design many other kinds of architects beyond just buildings. At the turn of the 20th century, inspired by the theory of Gesamtkunstwerk, many Art Nouveau architects began to plan specific interiors, down to the doorknobs, carpet, the dinner service, for the buildings they were designing. This is the cutlery designed by Van der Velde for his Blumenhof house, built in 1895 in Uccle in Belgium. Gesamtkunstwerk is a work of total art that combines several media to create a single, often powerful effect. The term was developed to discuss opera, in which acting, music, stage sets, costumes, etc., are all combined to rouse emotion. In the chapter, The Creative Destruction of the Total Artwork, From Hegel to Wagner to Beyond, the author argues that the German composer Richard Wagner's notion of Gesamtkunstwerk, termed as artwork of the future, must be read as a critical response and follow-up to Hegel's solution to the problematic contradictions of modernity. When in 1899 Van der Velde, in his famous essay in the journal Pan, takes up Wagner's idea of a synthesis of the arts, he bears witness to these contradictions. Now, Van der Velde was perhaps the first designer to extend the Gesamtkunstwerk ideal to clothing. In 1896, he and his new wife, Marie Sether, moved into Blumenwerf, their house that he had designed both inside and out. Each room was organised around a controlling visual motif. It was this integrated interior that prompted Van der Velde to first design clothing. The swelling lines on the back of the bodice and the lines of the deep folds also echo those of the piece of furniture on which she rests her left hand. According to Van der Velde's chronology, the decoration of the dress appears to be based on all the ideas of the former decor of the Blumenhof house. The concept continues even further through the Bauhaus and the Dutch de Stijl movement, from painting to chair design to the Rietveld Schroeder house. The image is of architecture as total artwork. On the way, the architects, practicing using alternative methods and modes of drawing and making, develop interdisciplinary skills beyond those conventionally attributed to the architect. The legacy continues with the contemporary example of Zaha Hadid, who, to quote Rowan Moore, as queen of the curve, designs not only award-winning buildings such as the London Aquatic Centre. On the left-hand side is her set design for the Pet Shop Boys. On the right-hand side is her collaboration with the fashion designer Karl Lagerfeld. So that's to design an installation for, it was a tribute to the Coco Chanel bag it's the stitched quilted bag with the gold chain. But then it keeps going. She's a shoe designer, she's a jewellery designer. So the one in the middle, you can actually buy it from her website. It goes further. She collaborates with will.i.am to design what's called the Striated Pulse smart cuff, which aims to transgress gender boundaries of what constitutes jewellery to be worn by both men and women. Now, clearly, there's been a change in the practice of architectural design, not only in terms of design discourse, no one really cares about decoration being criminal or not anymore, but also in the types of design artefacts produced. So in the middle, I've included the Alessi Juicer Salif Citrus Squeezer, the result of Alessi commissioning Philip Stark to design a tray. Now, it stands 29 centimetres high, is made from cast and polished aluminium, and it's still available for £43 from the alessi.com site. They produced 10,000 gold-plated versions, which were never intended for use, as the citric acid in the lemon discolours the juicer. Stark's rumoured to have said, "It's not meant to squeeze lemons, it's meant to start conversations." Now, this product, I think, represents the object designed by the genius designer, not necessarily meeting any of the user's design brief, but it's showing a designerly art practice. Far right instead is the iPhone 5, sorry, I just put it up there, a purpose-designed product which exploits interactive relations with its user. So it's an object designed also within a collaborative interdisciplinary team. Now, since the 1990s, architectural historians have been contesting the image of this singular genius author-designer and their singular genius building, right? The argument is that the works were always produced through collaborative teams. So some people, like Beatrice Colomina, call them couplings. And the idea is that two people collaborate, and it's the intertwining of this intimate social relations and thinking between an architect and not always an architect. So we can have a co-designer that's changing the way architecture is being thought and what's being produced. So in this instance, we have Lily Reich, and the argument, I think, if I quote Colomina, is that Mies might never have been Mies had he not met Lily Reich. And the argument there is, as an interior designer and someone who was producing exhibitions and installations that were sensual in their material quality, that it's that sensuality that changed the subsequent work. New interdisciplinary architecture groups emerge. Beginning in the 1950s, the Situation International, a collective of architects, artists, intellectuals, and political theorists, formed to engage architects with the construction of situations. The idea of the derive emerges, a series of events or game of events in space, and architecture transforms into an interactive, performative practice, critical of its dialectic fetish with form finding. The transformation from singular genius architect to interdisciplinary design collective prevents the singular author design researcher with the opportunity to transgress into either an interdisciplinary practitioner, and by this I mean that the architect learns another discipline themselves, or where they can collaborate with other people who have expertise in another discipline. Now here I've got an image of the Roman group of architects called Stalker, who you would have heard of, formed in 2002, and their nomadic walks, they were inspired by the SI, so the practice of walking along the landscape as an activist practice is one that they continue. But my point is that walking becomes the method of architectural design research, where they reclaim land by moving through it. They take their occupation of it as a starting point for the architectural design. And Stalker move through their research aspect of their practice to develop an approach to architecture that's therefore profoundly participatory. And these are their methods: walking, listening, making use of creative tools of mapping, interventions and participation. Stalker initiate processes of self-organisation that create convivial social spaces such as this one, which was one of their very early ones, the Campo Boario in 1990, which was for a Kurdish community, where they decided to take over it was a squatted building. Previously, I think, I can't recall, I'm sorry, but it was an abandoned building that they took over and then converted into a cultural centre. The piece has a longer life, so not only is the way it's produced different, but then the whole series of products, if we want to talk about them as design products, emerge. Kurdish festivals, workshops and a design competition. They also have art exhibitions and performances that accompany the development of the project. Now, the training of the design research team members dictates the medium, or what is the outcome of architectural research. Different types of media, visual and art practices, reveal different understandings of our bodies in space. The filmmakers and architects Ray and Charles Eames, for instance, use filmmaking as a method through which to undertake audiovisual research to make a critical commentary about everyday life. Charles Eames was inspired actually because he was a sort of frantic photographer, really. He was inspired by the photography of Alfred Stieglitz, and Stieglitz was one of the first American photographers to really impact on a kind of project of trying to document everyday life. So these sorts of images, soap bubbles from 1905, are exemplary of this sort of work. Now the Eames, it goes for them as soon as they wake up. Charles Eames starts photographing the breakfast table, the flowers that Ray arranges in their house. So the methodology becomes an ethnographic record of their rituals, collections and daily practices. Due to them being friends with the film director Billy Wilder, they begin to make advertisements and short films, one of which is called The House After 5 Years of Living, which you may have seen online. I'm not going to show it, I'm sorry. Now, I started to make films as a method of design research in 2004 when I was in Australia. And I've made different sorts of films. This one is one which I wrote about in a book called Scale, Imagination, Perception and Practice in Architecture. And it's a documentary film which is based on a house that I co-designed as part of the practice I'm in Oxford. It's called House After 2 Years of Living. And what I was trying to do was use the ethnographic method of research which the Eames had used in their filmmaking practice. The split screen in particular interested me because what it was doing was juxtaposing states of the house, and I wanted to show historical scales of the knowledge embedded in it, but also the scales of inhabitation. So, you know, my children's mess, Lego, orchids, chaos. It's a film which is trying to record both the design ideology and the way that we inhabit and, I guess, occupy it. Now, I've had quite a bit of time to think about what filmmaking is as design research, and I think that it goes beyond the usual limits of the medium used for publicity or for entertainment. So in architecture, it's used as representation, but representation for publicity purposes to articulate the design. And I've put here the work of Beeker and Lamont, and I met them a little while ago. And what's quite interesting for me was I had always been quite fascinated by their films, and I'd looked at them as a form of ethnographic design research. But in many ways, it really is very uncritical of the projects. And so I think the positioning of research is about having some other commentary about space in this instance, or these exceptional houses by the best known design architects in the world. I moved on to make a short film, and actually it was the expansion of my PhD. I decided that I would write a PhD and then try and make a filmic version of it. And that's because I discovered this thing by Richter, which is called the essay film. And the essay film is used in art practice as a space of critical commentary, but it's not a documentary as a documentary is made. There's a space of creativity, of imagination that exhibits itself within it or is present. So my point here is about the tools and techniques that film, if we take one mode or object of design research, can have to comment about architecture. As part of that, I designed some costumes, and I'm thinking it's getting to the point now where I can sort of go off in each tangent about how the design of costumes, if we go back to Velde, in fact articulates an architectural idea. My PhD was about kind of dissident practice in architectural history, so I was trying to uncover everybody who did everything they shouldn't do. And the costume itself is a kind of advocacy for peeling back and trying to uncover some other kind of creative practice within architectural research. Now, what I wanted to conclude with is that I think what I'm arguing here is that the appearance of design research in architecture can be one at various scales. I think you can design different kinds of objects. This goes way beyond the idea that design research is an object of design and there's textural exposition which supports that. I think it's much more creative in terms of its possibilities. The thing that's, I think, important to incorporate is the skills and the methods that we use. So as soon as we change the kinds of products, but we also change who we work with. And this is quite fundamental to, I think, new research directions for design research. One thing I wanted to conclude with is saying I'm not advocating working in a Gesamtkunstwerk mode. This isn't about matching style or aesthetic, but I think it's about opening up the palette of what we produce so that the paper on which architectural design research is produced is different, and the way that it's disseminated to other people outside of architecture is also different. Thank you very much.
That was sort of talking about architecture as a place to give generosity to inhabitation, and sort of looking at that versus the total art that architecture maybe not is anymore, but when people started expanding the notion of architecture, what it became, and sort of the growth between those two.
Yeah, I think it's quite important. I think, there are some people in architecture who ring fence what it is. You write a paper, they tell you what it is, they assess it on certain criteria. You produce a building, they assess it on certain criteria. And there's a very strong old guard that does that. Regardless of this design research work, that still is the main ground. And I think this idea that you can open it up and not be scared is something that Julia Kristeva wrote about quite extensively, about that it's a kind of open and positive space, not something to be concerned about. Yeah. It's not something that everybody feels. Yes.
Yes, please. I enjoyed a lot your talk, and I guess it kept me thinking about the role of collaboration. I think it seems that you were talking about two things. One is the architect doing interdisciplinary work because she takes a different position and she works from another discipline or through another different medium. And then the other is when the architect actually collaborates with somebody who has the expertise and who works in another medium. So I think the role of interdisciplinarity there is very different. And although I think you said that for you they're equally, I wonder if for you they're the same thing or if you see a difference.
No, I think they're different.
Because I guess my thinking behind this is that by reinforcing, when the architect takes other positions in other disciplines, I'm not sure to what extent that's a critical position that she takes, and to what extent is it reinforcing the authority of the architect, of that person who can actually do everything.
Well,
who can film, and who can do performative writing, and who can do poems and absolute enclose of everything. So that ability of somebody to operate in all these fields.
I think the difference from
does it actually create an architectural persona that is actually much more authoritative rather than more vulnerable and more in collaboration, more interdisciplinary. I guess I don't know if I'm expressing
No, it's fine.
the question well, but it's about.
I'm not. Say we take Hadid. I had somebody give a paper on OMA once, and it was really great. He started off by saying, "I'm going to give a paper on OMA, but I really don't like OMA." And I'm not advocating Hadid and her design. This isn't it. And I guess I'm putting her up there because what I'm saying is, in architectural design, there's a history of slipping across disciplines. I completely agree with the question of criticality in the way that you slip across disciplines, because you could argue it's merchandising, that design is becoming commodity within this. But within the design researcher's hands, that's a very different kind of practice. And at the end of it, when I was kind of rushing it, I was at a conference up in Dublin, and I made this phrase, which I said was, I think we need to promote critical visualization, because architectural design is so full of visuals that, we melt, but it means nothing. There's no commentary within that drawing. And I think what I'm arguing is that there is some commentary, there is an argument to be made through these artifacts in design research. Something that you mentioned that maybe I misunderstood about the question of either collaborating with other people in other disciplines or doing it yourself. Now, I think this is a really interesting one, because what it does is it asks you to learn two disciplines. And I know students might design things, so they might paint, but it's very, very different to be trained in fine arts and to be trained in architecture than it is to be an architect dappling in fine arts. And the thing about collaborating, it's a lot easier because it doesn't take you as much time to learn the craft, the history, and all the boundaries of that discipline. And so what it does is collaborating gives you knowledge through another person, where the transfer and exchange is, I guess, easier for the architect to embrace. And I did have in that a picture of Le Corbusier, the kind of classic photograph of him painting naked with his bottom to us. And the other one is of Aux Enfants, who he painted with. He was his apprentice. And I was thinking the only reason Corbusier came up with his whole philosophy was architecture was because of the way that Aux Enfants helped him understand a painterly practice. But it's about sort of being embedded within it. And I think it's different. In architecture, we're quite superficial. We think we know what we're doing when we work in another discipline. But the only way you can get closer is to learn it deeply or to collaborate with somebody else who knows it deeply. I don't know if I answered that. I only wrote this yesterday, so I was watching David because he told me if he was doing funny expressions, then it was incoherent. I'm sorry. No, it's fine.
We're terribly run out of time, so thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.